Steve was a massive ego. I mean, his ego was like the size of a mammoth, and that's what he had to learn to do to tame his ego, or rather, the world had to tame it for him because his belief in himself, like, yeah, he was always smart. He was always a genius in certain ways, but as a result, his ego was massive and he kept missing the boat and making mistakes. He would not listen to his team. One of the big problems with Next Computer at the beginning was that he started it because he wanted to get revenge on Apple and John Sculley, the CEO. He was doing it out of a sense of vengeance, out of a sense of bitterness and anger, even. And he wanted to start a company that he would have total control over. He didn't want to have a big board of directors to deal with. He didn't want to have a public company with stock options going out on the NASDAQ and all that. He said, "This is mine. No one's going to take it from me, and I'm going to be the commander, master, and commander of this new company."
Today's episode is brought to you by Dunedain Systems. Dunedain is excited to introduce Warmind, an AI platform purpose-built for the military. Warmind supports operational product generation, massively accelerating planning, operations knowledge management, and intel workflows. What makes Warmind different is it actually connects to your unit's data and learns how your specific warfighting function operates. It's not some generic chatbot. It's a full agentic system built by warfighters for warfighters. Warmind understands, learns, and helps you iterate on your SOPs, your planning processes, your MTO, your operational doctrine, and more. Units across SOCOM, the broader DoD, are already using it, already cutting workflows that used to take days down to minutes. Now, the beta is free for a limited time for .mil and .edu users. So head over to dunedinsystems.com. That's DUNEDAIN systems.com and just hit try for free. Today's episode sponsor is Aditon, creators of Aditon Operations Kit, the military's go-to software for personnel and equipment accountability. AOK goes where you do, any network, anytime, any place. I got to know Aditon's co-founders, James and JJ, several years ago. They are former Army NCOs who have years of experience in the tech industry. They understand that most military jobs aren't performed behind a computer desk. Personnel and operations are distributed, but accountability of property is paramount to making mission. That's where Logi, AOK's equipment management software, comes into play. Formerly known as 92X, Logi is a next generation of equipment management for the military. Logi offers unrivaled features for military teams on the go. Ingest and digitize your primary and sub-hand receipts. Generate and share sub-hand receipts and DA forms with your team in just a few clicks. Capture photos, tags, and notes across your team to build context on the state of equipment. Get easy on-the-go access to critical property records. Logi is custom built for the modern military professional. It gives you your valuable time back so you can get back to the mission at hand at home or in the field. Whether you're doing monthly inventories or preparing for deployment, Logi is your pocket property book, giving you real-time visibility into equipment status and mission readiness. Logi is currently in use across the U.S. Army Special Forces, and it's expanding. For a limited time, listeners of the From the Green Notebook podcast can try out Logi for free. Visit aditonppc.com/FTGN-Logi to get started. That's ADYTONPBC.com/FTGN-LOGE. How do I know what I think until I see what I say?
The Green Notebook, carried by military leaders around the world. Within those pages are sweat, tears, triumphs, and the hard-won lessons of life. Lessons worth sharing. Each week, the team dives into the notebooks of military leaders, business professionals, authors, athletes and coaches, and entertainers to share lessons and help you lead with the best version of yourself.
Welcome to another episode of From the Green Notebook. I'm your host, Joe Byerly, and today we're diving into the Green Notebook of Geoffrey Cain, author of the book Steve Jobs in Exile, which tells the story of the 12 years Steve Jobs spent away from Apple after being forced out of the company he co-founded. And before reading this book, I thought I knew the Steve Jobs story pretty well. Like most people, I knew about Apple, the Macintosh, the iPhone, the return to Apple in the late 90s. I even understood his ownership of Pixar and his role there. But what I didn't understand was how important those wilderness years really were. Because the Steve Jobs who came back to Apple wasn't the same person who left. The younger version of Steve was brilliant, but he was also impulsive, difficult, and convinced he could bend the world to his will. And over the course of 12 years at a company called NeXT, he failed repeatedly. He alienated people, missed opportunities, burned through money, and nearly disappeared from relevance altogether. But in the middle of that failure, he was also building the technology that would eventually become the foundation for Apple's comeback and shape the modern world that we live in today. In this conversation, Geoffrey and I talk about the Steve Jobs most people never hear about. Yes, we talk about the ego, but we talk a lot about failure, the wilderness years we all go through, and why genius without discipline eventually collapses under its own weight. We also talk about leadership, reinvention, and what happens when life humbles you enough to finally start listening, learning, and changing. Because this is a story about what failure can teach us, what it taught Steve Jobs, and what failure will teach us if we're willing to let it shape us instead of define us. So grab your green notebooks and please welcome to the show, Geoffrey Cain.
Great to be here, Joe.
Everybody, I think like everybody knows who Steve Jobs is. And when they think Steve Jobs, they think the iPod, the iPhone, like the second half of Steve Jobs. And even like I read the Walter Isaacson biography. And so that was like the only way I was even remotely familiar with his time at Next. And I didn't understand until I read Steve Jobs in Exile how important that time was. So I was wondering, like, for folks that are unfamiliar with like Steve Jobs 1.0, if we could just kind of start there, like, who was Steve Jobs when he founded Apple?
Steve Jobs was not the guy who we think we know when he founded Apple. And, that's one of the reasons why I set out to write this book, because we have this vision of Steve Jobs that, he was born brilliant, that he grew up smart and he was tuned into technology. And he started Apple and he released the Macintosh, which was his big, first major computer. There was the 1984 commercial, the really famous one, where the woman's running with the sledgehammer and she smashes the big brother on the big screen. Like everybody knows this. It's Silicon Valley lore. You see it in movies, you see it in books. But the way that we remember it is not actually how Steve Jobs was, not in the first half of his life. When he was at Apple, he was difficult. I mean, people did not want to work with him. A lot of the engineers who did work with him refused to continue working with him after he was pushed out in 1985. He wasn't well liked by a lot of his peers. He was seen as overstepping. He would go in, he would push people around, he would overstep his authority and say, do this and do that. We have to remember that, Steve Jobs, as a young man, was somebody who was so convinced of his own brilliance that he couldn't see his flaws. So, Apple, it's obviously a really successful company now. It wasn't always a really successful company before. And when Steve Jobs was pushed out, this happened in the year 1985, kind of a forgotten story. He had made a series of missteps, some decisions that really hurt the company. And so his CEO, John Sculley, one of the things, Steve Jobs was not actually the CEO of Apple. That's another thing that's often forgotten. He actually headed the Macintosh unit. He was the maker of the Macintosh. And so his CEO, John Sculley, decided it was time for him to go and got the board together, pushed him out. Steve Jobs had tried to launch a power coup against John Sculley. He was traveling to China. He was going to go to a big event there, and then Steve Jobs decided that he was going to walk into the board and oust John Sculley, and he would make himself the CEO because he just loved Apple so much and he wanted to run Apple, and he did not like John Sculley. But what really happened was John Sculley caught wind of it. He was, he caught wind of this plot. He did not go to China, and then he joined the board meeting, got there early, and ambushed Steve as he walked in, getting ready for his coup. So these were the events, these were the dominoes that collapsed into the end of Steve Jobs at Apple version 1, and that's where my book begins. I just say all this because, we all have a story in our mind with Steve Jobs. We all think, there's Apple version 1, and then Steve Jobs disappeared and went into the wilderness for 12 years, and he was just kind of wandering. And then suddenly he returned, and there was Apple version 2, and he saved Apple version 2 and saved the day. And that's why we have the iPhone and the iPod now. That's why Apple is a $4 trillion company. But that's not how the story went at all. It's those middle years that are really the defining years in what made Steve Jobs into the person who we know.
And so, how old was he roughly when Scully took over and kicked him out of Apple?
He was in his late 20s when John Scully became the CEO. And the idea was that Scully was going to be the adult supervision. Steve Jobs he was in his 20s. He was young. It was kind of seen still as a scrappy but fast growing startup. And they really needed experienced leadership at the helm. But they quickly clashed. So they quickly clashed over a number of things. The future of the Macintosh computer. There were different directions that Apple was experimenting with. And one of the questions, just for example, was, do we make a Macintosh for businesses? That means, do we follow IBM into that market? And you got to remember that IBM at the time was the biggest tech company in the world. It was like the big tech of the age. And Apple was the little startup fighting it. And then the other question was, do we stick with the personal computer model, and keep something that's simple, that's drawing and painting and typing for people at home. And they made a really big series of missteps, and as a result, the inventories were soaring, budgets were soaring, they were running out of money fairly quickly, and Apple posted its first loss ever in the year 1985, and that's what really led to the ouster of Steve Jobs. So when this all happened, he was 30 years old. He was a guy who was known for saying, don't trust anyone over 30. That was his ethos. He was a hippie. And, he turns 30. He has this surprisingly lonely birthday party. Ella Fitzgerald, the singer, shows up. She's a famous jazz singer. And she, is like, who the heck is Steve Jobs? There's a guy here named Steve who wants me to sing happy birthday for him. But, it's like Steve Jobs is really not that famous at the time. And that's something we forget. So, you got to think about the toll this must have taken on him. 30 years old, he thinks he's approaching the prime of his life. It's just been up, 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 for all of his 20s. And then suddenly the company that he has co-founded, that he put his heart and soul into, is taken away from him. And that's a dramatic shift. I mean, it's crushing. Like the people who knew him at the time just said that he was an outcast and he was really hitting rock bottom, and he did not know what to do with himself at this time. And this is why, in the end, he decided to leave Apple and start his next company, which is called NeXT Computer.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty amazing. Again, like 30 years old, like Apple is pretty much his baby. And he's told like, you're not welcome here anymore. And I wonder like how many people would have just been like, all right, well, I guess this is it. But instead he comes back, and I think like the biggest thing that I didn't know was, one, how much we owe to NeXT, the stuff that they created over that 12-year period. And then how many, like, there's so many times in your book where like NeXT should have been, like, we wouldn't even be talking about Windows. Like Windows would be the next of the counterfactual history right now if like it wasn't for Steve Jobs. So, so just to give people like a scope over that 12-year period, what were some of like the innovations and things that NeXT created that we could like, that we recognize today?
Well, that's the beauty of the story. So NeXT Computer itself has been totally forgotten, but if you pick up any Apple device, if you're using an iPhone, using the iOS, you're using, any kind of iPod, you had an iPad back in the day for your music. So much of this technology depends on NeXT Computer software. So this is not something that Apple innovated out of the blue. What actually happened was that Steve Jobs was developing this as early as the late 1980s. It really picked up in the 1990s. It was an operating system called NeXTSTEP. NeXTSTEP is you could say, so, in archaeology, this is a comparison that Steve Jobs drew himself. In archaeology, you have like, you look at a mountain and there are different layers of sediment, and you can see, like where certain things came from, when certain tools were made. Did they use bronze or iron or that sort of thing? Next step was the layer that the foundation that was laid in these years that led to the creation of Apple's operating system later when Steve Jobs returned. But not only the operating system, it actually became the basis of Apple's renaissance. Without that key software that he developed in this time period, there would probably be no iPhone, running this OS. I mean, the whole experience, the iPod, like every screen that you look at that's an Apple screen, it would be completely different today, and it would just be unrecognizable. And it's entirely plausible in my view that none of this would even exist at all. It would just be some other technology. Like there wouldn't be an iPhone with this beautiful software. So here's what's so amazing about this story. Steve Jobs was designing this 20 years before a lot of this happened. The iPhone came out in 2007. He was developing this exact same system called object-oriented programming as early as 1986, and by some accounts, even earlier. So, he was 20 years ahead of the game. Object-oriented programming is a different kind of software development. It's really common nowadays, but at the time it was novel and revolutionary. And what it did is it replaced regular coding, which was clunky and difficult, and made it so much easier so that you could drag and drop, what are called objects. So these objects would, an object would be like a form that you click on, or, something that you type in, just to give some examples. And objects were brilliant because it's like making software like clay. You can kind of shape it, you can direct it, you can tell it to do this and that, and it'll sort of know what to do on its own. You don't have to program it every single time. So 20 years ahead of its time, this is now the defining software of our age. And there's Steve Jobs, who was doing this at a time when he was at abject, absolute failure, when nobody believed in what he was doing. He said, we're going to do this. And this is what allowed him to return to Apple and save it.
But like during that period, though, like, again, we keep talking about like this should have been this technology should have taken on about 20 years previous. But like, what role did Steve's ego still play in the collapse of so many opportunities in that 12-year period?
Steve was a massive ego. I mean, his ego was like the size of a mammoth. And that's what he had to learn to do to tame his ego, or rather, the world had to tame it for him, because his belief in himself, like, yeah, he was always smart. He was always a genius in certain ways. But as a result, his ego was massive, and he kept missing the boat and making mistakes. He would not listen to his team. One of the big problems with NeXT Computer at the beginning was that he started it because he wanted to get revenge on Apple and John Sculley, the CEO. He was doing it out of a sense of vengeance, out of a sense of bitterness and anger, even. And he wanted to start a company that he would have total control over. He didn't want to have a big board of directors to deal with. He didn't want to have a public company with stock options going out on the NASDAQ and all that. He said, this is mine. No one's going to take it from me. And I'm going to be the master and commander of this new company. But as a result, that's no way to build a company. So he brought in some of the best people in Silicon Valley, people like Daniel Lewin, master marketer. Susan Tribble was his financial maven. He had Bud Tribble, one of the best software developers of a generation. These just some, and this is just a small list of the people. Anybody who's familiar with Apple history will know these names because they are just monumental figures. He had them all on his team, and he kept alienating them. He would, they would be working on a product together, and he would say things like, "Okay, so you developed a chip, great chip, but I want it to look prettier." So he would go in and he would like move around all the little pieces on this chip, and this is one very specific story. And it just blows up the project and delays it for another month and then 2 months, because every time he makes these crazy changes, like, yeah, it looks prettier, but from an engineering standpoint, it's just so difficult to accomplish. So he's self-sabotaging. He's searching for some kind of future perfection that just doesn't exist in the time that he lives in. And as a result, he alienates all of his key lieutenants, like the people who stood by him at Apple as he was failing, the people who took big risks and went with him and joined him at this new little startup. They were all really upset because he would yell and he would scream, and he would make decisions that would just blow up the entire business. And that's the opening tragedy of Next. I mean, I just want to say that's not the whole story because, you got to read the whole book to see how he transforms. But at the start, it's just he's irrational. He's making bad decisions. And there are so many instances throughout the early story of Next Computer where, he's got everything he needs. He has the IBM deal. So IBM wants to sign a deal. They're going to put his software on IBM computers that are shipped all over America. He blows that up. He has one of his main investors, Ross Perot, the guy who ran for president twice. Some people might remember him from the 90s. Key investor. He lined up federal agencies for Steve Jobs. The intelligence agencies, the CIA and the NSA were all going to buy his advanced computers. Steve Jobs blows it up because of his ego. There are so many examples of this, and the whole story of Next is about how Steve Jobs is brought to heel and how his ego must be tamed so that he can learn the lessons that he must learn to succeed later.
Yeah, you have a great line in there in the book. You said genius without discipline ends in expensive failure. And it's so true. It's he had all these opportunities. He had the backing of Ross Perot, other companies. I think was it Canon that was just like sinking money into the company, and like he's throwing all of it away again because of ego. So you had this, like, it's almost like there were two tracks that were happening simultaneously. So you have Next on track one, which Steve is just destroying. Could you also talk about another acquisition that he made? I think it was like 1985 from George Lucas, which it's a completely different story.
That's what is so funny about the storyline here. Next Computer was where Steve was a control freak in the opening years, and that's why he failed. But Pixar is his other big project. So what happened? George Lucas at the time was going through a really expensive divorce, and he had to sell Pixar at a fire sale, $5 million, which is nothing. I mean, look at Pixar today. Look at the films that they make, acquisition by Disney. So at the time, Pixar is this kind of scratchy, rackety, rickety muck design studio. They're making 3D computer graphics, which is the future. And not a lot of people really see the vision that Steve Jobs sees, that George Lucas sees, which is that in the future they believe that computer graphics are going to be so integrated into film that it's just going to become a fact of everyday life. I mean, think about how far ahead of his time he is, because this was a time when everybody was animating by hand, and here's Pixar coming along. But the story turned out completely differently at Pixar because Ed Catmull and John Lasseter, those were the two head people there. They gave Steve an ultimatum. They knew the stories. They knew that this guy was a bit eccentric and controlling, and he was going to come in and blow up everything if they gave him too much power. So they told him up front, we are going to make you stay out of the creative meetings. So you're not allowed to come to the weekly creative meeting. If you do, it's bad news. That's the only way we're going to get anything done. And Steve Jobs, he accepts that. He realizes that that's the way it's going to happen. And so Steve actually takes the role where he's at his best, and he's the guy. He'll give a great presentation. He'll talk about Toy Story on stage. He'll line up deals. He'll get investors. He'll go make deals with Disney. Like, that's Steve. Like, he's a great deal maker. He's a theatrical speaker. But once he's out of the actual creative work, suddenly Pixar works out again. And how did Pixar end? Well, in the mid 1990s, in 1996, the movie Toy Story came out. That led to a $1 billion major IPO. I mean, one of the first major IPOs of that age, and that's what made Steve Jobs a billionaire. So we forget about that too. Like, we think, oh yeah, Steve Jobs, he released the first Apple computers in the 1980s. He must have been a billionaire. But no, that's not true at all. He was actually, for someone of his stature, quite poor for a great deal of his life. And according to the people I interviewed who were very close to him, he was down to the last 2 or 3 years of personal cash. Like, he was literally going to run out of his own money funding these companies. But Toy Story saved him, and it only saved him because he backed off and he let the talented people that he hired do what they needed to do.
Do you think, I think Ed Catmull either you wrote it or Ed wrote it in his afterword. But do you think it was because Ed pushed back against Steve, whereas other people acquiesced to him along the way, that like Steve respected that, and that's kind of one of the reasons he stayed out of Ed and John Lasseter's way?
Yes, and talking with, or rather, dealing with Steve Jobs, if you're new to dealing with him, it would feel like walking on eggshells. He's got this thing called the hero shithead roller coaster. You never know where you stand. One day you're a hero, the next day you're a shithead. So get ready. And that's something that everybody at both Pixar and Next would talk about. But what Steve really wanted, so that all seemed kind of unpredictable. But what Steve really wanted was people who had enough force to push back on him. It wasn't obvious at first. It's something that you had to learn from interacting with him. If he came in and called your idea shitty and he said, "This sucks," he didn't want you to say, "Oh, sorry, Steve, I'll do better next time." What he wanted you to say was a full hearted defense of what you were doing. No, this is great. This is why I did it this way. This is why it's going to sell. This is why the customer wants it. This is why the advertisement looks that way. If you could successfully defend yourself against him, sometimes for like over a half hour, over an hour, if you could stand up to him and keep pushing back, finally at a certain point he would say, "Okay, good," and then he would walk out and get to the next thing. Not everyone had that ability to push back because he was a forceful personality. Like, you really had to be on your top game and you had to know how to maneuver around him. But I think one of the reasons why Ed Catmull at Pixar was a success with him was because he knew how to withstand that personality, and he knew how to wait it out, and he knew, that if he just waited longer and kept it going with Steve, eventually Steve would see the importance of whatever it was that they were dealing with.
I was thinking about this, like speaking of personality, and this may be like a too meta of a question, Geoffrey, but like the thing about Steve, what I noticed throughout your book is like he's literally tanking Next. Like everything's going to shit, everything's behind schedule, and yet people are still believing in him, like still giving
Yeah.
money. You even talk about like there was like one guy who couldn't make a deal, and then Steve would walk in the room and do Steve, and then all of a sudden, like these guys are buying all these machines or placing these like large purchase orders. So, what do you think it says about a person like Steve and when a guy like Steve comes along, and then just like human nature for everybody else?
Steve was in a league of his own. Everybody who was close to him said that he was wired differently. He saw the world differently. Some people speculated maybe he had some kind of what we would call, a personality disorder, or he was on a spectrum. I have no proof of that, and I just mentioned that because it's what people observed. Obviously, I don't know if he had a diagnosis, like a formal diagnosis. That's not what I'm saying. But um, Steve, from the time he started Apple, he really was in a league of his own. Um, People could see his brilliance, even though he would mess up a lot. And that's what he had to learn to do. He had to learn, that brilliance alone is not enough. That charisma alone is not enough. People would snap towards him. He would walk into a room, and the energy just gravitates around him. They have this thing called the reality distortion field, which was, Steve could convince you of anything. If it was a product that was clearly terrible and not going to sell, he could convince you it was going to sell great. That those are powerful instincts to have. Steve was always a powerful man in that respect. But the question of this story about Next Computer is, how do you take those powerful instincts, those powerful talents that you're given, and how do you discipline them? How do you train them? If you're a talented person, it's not enough to simply be talented. Like, yeah, you could, sit in your garage all day and make cool computers, and you're a computer genius. But the difference between that and a true success is, does the world want what you're giving them? Steve made the mistake early in his life of building an entire company as a monument to his own genius. He thought that this computer the next computer, which was called the Cube, was going to be so awesome and so far ahead of its time that his customers would, beat down a path to his company, and they would, take out their checkbooks. They'd write $1 million checks, and they would all want to be a part of, the same big party. That was a fundamental and devastating mistake for Steve, and that's what led to his failures. The taming of Steve came over these 12 years of wilderness. What tamed Steve was the realization that he had to operate within the limits of what the physical world could do out there, of what the markets could do for him, what people wanted. And Steve even talked about this in one interview at one point. He said, reflecting, that he's realized that vision alone is not enough, that execution is really what matters, because you can't make atoms do certain things. You can't make electrons do certain things. At a fundamental level, the world is your limiting force. And the true gift of the genius is the person who can take a great vision, but can unify it with the world out there and what the world truly wants from you.
I'd like to introduce you to our newest partner, Roger Bank, a modern digital military bank built by military members for military members. Whether you're stationed stateside or overseas, Roger is designed to meet the unique needs of our men and women in uniform. I recently opened an account myself, and the process was incredibly smooth. It took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. Now, here's why I'm excited to partner with Roger. They offer high-yield checking and savings accounts, zero account fees, early payday, and automatic savings with Roundup Match. Their military-ready direct deposit form is even auto-populated and signed by the CEO, saving you time and hassle. Plus, you get free global ATM access, real person customer support, and they even offer accounts for service members as young as 17. Funds are FDIC insured through Citizens Bank of Edmond, so you can bank with confidence and peace of mind. Visit roger.bank to learn more. That's ROGER.bank. I was thinking, throughout history, there's people that have been given the gift, the same gift that Steve Jobs had. And, they've either squandered it or they've made something out of it. I'm thinking the P.T. Barnums of the world, like Elon Musk has continued to, create things. He's had a couple issues here and there, but he's continued to push the ball forward. So yeah, I do think it's people are going to gravitate towards their personality like that. And if somebody's listening and they recognize that they have a personality that's magnetic, like Steve, that they could literally sell ice to an Eskimo. I think it's on them to train that, which is what exactly, I don't think he did it on purpose. Like you said, the world had to train him in order to become the Steve Jobs of 1997 when he returned to Apple.
Yeah, I think you just summed it up really well. That's exactly right. And that's the trajectory that Steve was on during these years. And it's interesting when you look at literature and world history, mythology, you often find the famous story structure, the hero's journey. One of the things I did in this book, I opened with a famous line from Dante's Inferno about entering the wilderness, entering the forest, and what it does to you midway upon the journey of life. That's a really famous line that he opened with in his first chapter. And that really resonated with me as I was going into this project, because I was thinking, Steve Jobs, we all know the stories about his successes, but what does it take to really become Steve Jobs? You don't just wake up one morning and suddenly you're Steve Jobs. Even Steve Jobs, as I learned in this project, was not really Steve Jobs when he was younger, at least in the sense he was not the Steve Jobs who we know. And so what are these wildernesses that, we all have to go through? I think that in a lot of our lives, we encounter those lost years. We encounter that edge of the forest, and we realize that we're about to make a leap and there's no returning, but it's a leap that's going to shape us and form us in powerful ways that we've never seen before. And it's interesting because, in ancient, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancients had this in Greek mythology. There's the story of Odysseus and the journey that he took, the voyages. There's even, in modern lore, we have Star Wars and, we have Lord of the Rings. These are all roughly based on hero's journey arcs, and they're not all the same. I'm not saying like the writers are not taking one template and applying it to everything, but the overarching journey that the protagonist must go on really speaks to something deep and something soulful that I think a lot of people are looking for. And what I just found so fascinating about this book is that Steve Jobs, he lived that. He's the greatest modern embodiment of the hero's journey. He went right in, and he was perhaps a little too overconfident going into that wilderness, but he came out transformed, and he came out disciplined in ways that if he had not gone through that wilderness, he would have failed, and we would not remember him today.
Yeah, I think one of the, when you talk about the steps of the hero's journey, like it begins, once the hero hears the call, they end up leaving home. I think what's interesting with Steve was he left home, he left Apple. And then, towards the end of the journey, as it makes its full arc, the hero returns home. And so as he came back to Apple, it's one of my favorite descriptions of it is the hero comes back unrecognizable. And so the Steve that came back in 1997, and you do a really good job in the final chapters of the book. Like it's like a completely different person. Like you even
Thank you.
have some like small little instances in there of like where Steve's like, and I imagine people back there, who had known Steve before, like, oh, what is he going to do? And he seems a lot more quiet, a lot more reserved. Like he's listening to people now for the first time. He's creating alliances where he would have shunned everybody else before. And so, yeah, I think the journey is so important. And so many times I think in our own lives, like again, going back to like us in this, and you can see this in the story, is it like we get hit and life slaps us in the face, and you may look at like certain years of your life as wasted. They were hard, they were, terrible. But then like what lessons are you able to pull from those to help you in that, that next phase of life, which is there's so many that Steve learned in this one.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are so many lessons that he learned, and like there are so, as I was writing the book, going through my head, I would see something happen to him, and I would think, oh, so this is a lesson of life. And what I just found so fascinating was that so many of these lessons are universal. Some of them are certainly unique to Steve, and Steve being Steve had to learn this and that. He had to learn to tame his massive ego. But there's something even bigger to the story, and it's that, you look at great leaders like Winston Churchill and Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the greatest leaders of centuries ago even had to go through a time when they were tested and when the trials were hard. I mean, just to give one really good example, Theodore Roosevelt was in the wilderness for a long time. He was, I mean, he was literally down in the Amazon. There's a great book by a woman, an author named Candace Millard, on the wilderness years of Roosevelt, and that's part of what was the inspiration for this book. I thought, every leader has gone through something so hard before they became the leader we know. And who are the major figures of our era today who've gone through this? This is not merely mythology. This is something that is lived and experienced the world over, including now.
Yeah, I want to read this because this is like one of my, I mean, like, granted, you didn't write it, but it's one of my favorite lines of the book. It's the very last part by Ed Catmull. And he says, the lessons for the rest of us, lesson for the rest of us is clear. Don't attempt to emulate Steve's final form. Instead, embrace the work of personal transformation. Develop the intense curiosity to learn from mistakes and adjust course accordingly. Test your ideas against those of others. Be open to being proven wrong, above all, when you fail. Always be willing to begin again. And that's exactly what Steve does in this book. And again, I think I was just blown away because there was so much I didn't know. Like I remember going to like computer stores, software stores in the mall when I was a kid. And I remember like on the shelf, there was a Doom CD-ROM that was like sitting there, and like Like you just grabbed it. I think it was like $2 or something. It was like or free. It was like the first level of Doom. And that game was like a game changer for me as a kid. Like you talk in the book about the internet, like ordering things off the internet. Like we take all that for granted, but like that went back to Steve and the work he did at Next, which I didn't know any of that, man.
Yeah, yeah. And it's I didn't know about these stories either when I started the book. They were out there. What I found that was so incredible here was that a lot of these stories they've been forgotten, but the material was all sitting out there. So there were lots of archives that had never been open. Lots of people who were close to Steve who had never really told their story publicly before. But really, what a lot of them wanted to do was correct the record because they felt that the way that Steve is remembered in popular memory now, everybody remembers Steve, the difficult asshole who happens to be a visionary. Like that's how the story usually goes. Yeah, Steve Jobs, he made the iPhone. He was also a real asshole, right? Um, so yeah, he was difficult, and he even by the end of his life, he was still difficult, but he was tempered in that difficultness. He was tempered and matured, and he had learned how to take those talents he had and how to channel them into the right focus, the right energy. If you're talented at something, you don't go run off and just try to do, everything that you want to do under the sun with your talents. That's a mistake that Steve Jobs made. You have to focus and you have to find the things that really matter to people out there. You can make a beautiful computer that's shaped like a perfect cube, and that's what he did at Next Computer. But the reality is that no one gives a shit if your computer is shaped like a perfect cube. A museum will care about that, and they still house the cube. That's quite common now. An industrial design class will care about that. You can study how he, built this beautiful work of art. But the typical computer user is not out there shopping, thinking like, I need a work of art, on my office desk right now. I'm looking for the next Steve Jobs computer. Now, that said, the iPhone, when it came out, in many ways, it was a work of art. Like it was a masterpiece of usability and software and technology. All the things it could do were truly game changing for the time. But for Steve to get to that level where he could produce a work of art that was that impactful, he first had to realize that the phone had to connect with what people wanted for him. And what better way to do it than a phone? Like everybody needs a phone, uses a phone. So that's how you get your vision out into the world.
Yeah. The other piece of it too is you talk about Steve Jobs, the asshole. Another thing was like as he got older and as he became more tempered, like his humanity, and he had a family, like his humanity came through. Could you just share some of the instances that you uncovered in your research where like Steve was like you read about it, you're like, man, like Steve's amazing.
That was one of the most surprising things when I was writing this book. I had no idea that these stories like actually happened. So Steve, in his later years, so when he was about 40, he was in his 40s, he was 40 years old, and he had a family. He had married Lorraine Powell Jobs. So having family and having kids was one of the major steps that had tempered him and made him a little more circumspect and softer. There are many reasons for that, and the really the transformation that happened from his kids is one of the great personal transformations that hasn't been documented in his life. And so this softening that happened, it really came in the late 19, kind of the mid to late 1990s. He would um, book hospital rooms at the best hospitals in the country for employees who were having emergency crises, or they were really sick, or there was some bad thing that happened. So just to give one example, I heard this story from a Next computer executive. There was a woman who had a really severe terminal form of cancer and only had a few weeks to live, and had a young daughter who really, really wanted to see Toy Story. She was totally amped up for that, but it wasn't clear that the mother was going to survive until the launch of Toy Story. But she really wanted to spend this last moment with her daughter and spend this time together before she was gone. So this next executive went to Steve and said, "Hey, this is what's happening. This is happening to one of my relatives." So they were related, and said, "Could you please just make an exception this time?" and please allow this little girl and her dying mom to see Toy Story. And at first, Steve was against it because he said, it might leak. But very soon, Steve turned around and he said, okay, so I will do this, and I will send a team there to show them Toy Story. So they got a little private viewing at home. The mom cuddled up with the daughter. They had Toy Story dolls everywhere, Woody and all that. And they watched it, and only a few days later, the mom died. So it was her last profound moment with her daughter before she could say goodbye. And Steve allowed it to happen in a way that was, just so, so heartwarming. This is not the kind of Steve that you see in the news. It's not the kind of Steve that you see out there in movies and media. But part of the reason is that Steve didn't want this in his public persona. He actually told people, "I don't want you to tell anyone about this." And this is only one example. There are many other examples that I heard of this kind of saving grace.
Yeah, it's amazing. And like as I'm reading it, I learned a lot more about Steve Jobs, and that, what this period of his life not only did for him, but also, like, did for all of us, because everything that, like I said, the things that we do today, a lot of them are because of Steve Jobs. Another interesting thing was, like, when he had family, and he said, and you write something in the book as well, that Steve alludes to. He's like, "Hey, like, the stuff I create is going to be obsolete in like 10 years, but like my children are going to be around for much longer." And I totally screwed that up, Jeffrey. But like, I think there's like also, I know he wasn't known as being the best parent in the world, but I think again, there's like good advice in there for all of us who, are thinking about having kids or having kids. Like, like, where are you putting your time, effort, and energy into? And you saw that shift too with Steve a little bit later in his life.
Yeah, you did. And that's because Steve hit rock bottom. He hit rock bottom. It was the year 1993 and 94. What happened is that the NeXT computer hardware division collapsed. It was effectively bankrupt. Half the company was laid off. I mean, it was a total disaster. People thought literally there are press reports back then, Fortune magazine calling Steve Jobs a scammer and a snake oil salesman. You have to remember that the way that Steve is viewed today is not how he was viewed at the time. And a lot of people thought that he was just full of it, that he was not the future and he was just peddling fake stuff. He was not well liked by a lot of people in Silicon Valley. Um, and, hitting rock bottom in the mid 90s, that was one of the moments that I think made him realize that, family is really what matters in life. He can go out there, he can be Steve Jobs, the great visionary. He can go out there and, release his products. But at the end of the day, you know, people, products are sediment. And he even said that they're layers of sediment. This is technology that even he admitted is fleeting, that will be obsolete. He even literally said that, quote, that most of the things that he created are going to be obsolete in 10 years or so. That didn't happen, actually. He was actually wrong about himself, but his prediction, he thought that he was
Sure.
fading. And he thought that, he thought that, in 10 years, the stuff that he was making was not really going to matter anymore. And this is the moment when he started turning towards family, his wife and kids. And there's a really memorable moment in the book in which, Steve Jobs is talking about new technology, but for once he admits that it's not going to change the world. He literally said, "This technology does not change the world, but it can make life easier in some ways." And one of the examples he gave in this one interview is he was looking to buy a laundry machine, and they were, he was there with his kids and his wife Lorraine, and they were just looking like, do we get the Miele or do we get the American one or the German one? And they finally went home and they had dinner and they talked about their family and what they value and what they want out of a washing machine. And they decided to go with the Miele, the German one. And Steve said, like that's what I want. So Steve Jobs, the family man, no longer holding up his grand computer. He just needs, a washing machine for his clothes, and he's picking one that's going to work for his family. And he admitted that like that's the purpose of technology. It's not changing your life. It's washing your clothes.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, there's a lot of leaders who listen to this podcast, and who subscribe to my monthly reading list email, and so like they'll see this book on there too. And so, besides learning these lessons about Steve, which is like Steve wasn't, he didn't come out a genius to change the world. Like he had to go through this 12 years of, what you're calling the wilderness. What do you hope leaders are able to pull for themselves out of this book?
If you're going through hard times, Steve Jobs went through hard times, and if Steve Jobs can get through hard times, you can get through hard times. That's the biggest takeaway. That's like the number one takeaway that I hope people see reading this book. Look, Steve Jobs went through some of the worst things that anyone could throw at you. I mean, he was down and out. He was failing. The press was making fun of him. It was all very public. I mean, he was really. I mean, he was very close to being written out of history, and yet somehow he turned around. So the hard times, the moments in the wilderness. If you're being laid off, struggling with your startup, you're up until 2 a.m. at night trying to figure out what to do. You're staring out into the darkness. Oh no, what's going to happen next? Just remember, look, failure is not the end. The failure can be the setup for the next success. And that's what Steve Jobs was the master at here at NeXT Computer. Yes, it was a failure at first, but he used it to lay the foundation for his greatest act, and that was his return to Apple.
Oh, that's a great way to end the podcast, Geoffrey. If yeah, it was just it was a great line. Well, like if folks listening to this interview want to learn more about you, more about your work, where can they find you?
I'm on X at Geoffrey_Cain, my name. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can just type my name in there. And my website is geoffreycain.net. So I sell the book at every major bookstore, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere else. So hope you enjoy it. It was really a labor of love for years, and I'm just so happy that this story and message are out in the world now.
Yeah, again, great job with it too. This is another one of the books where I put everything else I was doing down and just started like plugging away at it. And a lot of books I feel like cover same tracks over again. Like, you could read a book and it's like been covered in 6 or 7 other books. This is the first time, with something on Steve Jobs where there was nothing, there was like maybe 2 things, the beginning and the end of your book were the only 2 things that I was like, yeah, I've heard this before, but the rest, 98% of it, the story of NeXT was I was completely amazed by it and saw again, like so many applications for my own life and, just a greater appreciation for what failure and, the times in our life where, we think like it can't get any worse. How those can actually shape and define us and prepare us, like you said, for that next act. So well done. And I hope a lot of people read this book, man.
Thanks, Joe. Really appreciate that. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you again for listening to another episode of From the Green Notebook podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please give us 5 stars wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and the opportunity to help more people on their leadership journey. Also, make sure you check out our website at www.fromthegreennotebook.com. There, you can listen to past episodes, read leadership articles written by military leaders from around the world. You can sign up for our monthly reading list email where you can learn about new books that are coming out, and our Sunday reflection email that comes out every Sunday morning. Is really short. It's a 2-minute read, but I guarantee you it's going to start your week off on the right foot. Finally, make sure you follow us on Twitter at FTGN Notebook, and you can find us on Instagram and Facebook by searching for From the Green Notebook. Again, thank you so much for coming on this journey with us. I am humbled by the opportunity to learn these lessons alongside you. So please join us next week for another episode of From the Green Notebook, where we're going to help you lead with the best version of yourself.
I can't